For more than 30 years, I sat behind that desk on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, smiling, laughing, making millions of people feel comfortable. But the truth is, what happened after the cameras stopped, that's what stayed with me. Because after thousands of interviews, you start seeing through people. The charm, the performance, the image, it all starts to fade. And what's left, that's who they really are. #1, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra didn't enter a room, he arrived. There's a difference. You could feel it before you even saw him. That kind of presence. It doesn't need an introduction. It doesn't need applause. It just exists. On camera, Frank was exactly what you'd expect. Smooth, controlled, effortless. The kind of guest who could sit down, say almost nothing, and still hold an audience. He understood timing. He understood silence. And most importantly, he understood power. But off camera, that same presence felt different. He didn't come alone. He never did. There were always men with him. Not assistants, not publicists, something else. They didn't smile, they didn't engage, they watched. And suddenly, the room felt smaller, tighter, like everyone was being measured. And then something small would happen. A floor manager doing his job, giving a simple time cue, something routine, something every guest understood, except Frank. Because with him, nothing was routine. The reaction wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive. That would have been easier to deal with. No, it was controlled. Cold. The kind of reaction that doesn't raise its voice, but still makes everyone uncomfortable. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't confidence. This wasn't charisma. This was control. The need to dominate a space, to remind people who they were dealing with. And once you see that, you can't ignore it. Because talent may earn respect, but behavior defines it. And in that moment, I knew exactly where I stood. #2, Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was something else entirely. Where Sinatra was presence, Joan was precision. Everything about her was calculated, measured, controlled down to the smallest detail. Before she even stepped on stage, instructions were already in place. Lighting angles, camera positions, even the temperature of the room. Nothing was left to chance. And when she finally arrived, it all made sense. Because Joan didn't just want to look perfect, she needed to be perfect. On camera, she was exactly what Hollywood promised. Graceful, elegant, untouchable. A kind of star that defined an era. But backstage, that illusion didn't last. Because perfection takes effort. And sometimes, that effort cracks. I remember hearing about an incident before the show. A young assistant, new to the job, trying to do everything right. She walked into the dressing room, carrying something Joan had requested. And in a single moment, everything changed. The reaction wasn't frustration. It wasn't even anger. It was something colder, something sharper. Words that weren't just meant to correct, but to cut. And what made it worse was how quickly it disappeared. Because minutes later, Joan walked onto that stage and became someone else entirely, smiling, laughing, engaging, like nothing had happened, like the person backstage didn't exist. And that's when I realized something important. Some people don't have two sides. They have two performances. And one of them is only meant for the people who can't fight back. #3, Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was chaos. Not the bad kind. At least not at first. On camera, that chaos was magic. Energy, movement, unpredictability. The audience loved it. They couldn't look away. And I understood why. Because when it worked, it really worked. But off camera, that same energy didn't switch off. It kept going. Louder, stronger, harder to control. He didn't just join conversations, he took them over. Redirected them, dominated them. And slowly, what felt entertaining on stage started feeling overwhelming behind it. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was small. He reached over and adjusted my tie. Now to most people, that means nothing. A harmless gesture. But in my world, that's a boundary. A simple one. And he crossed it without hesitation. Not by accident. On purpose. And in that moment, everything became clear. Because respect isn't shown in big moments. It's shown in small ones. In the things you don't think about. And the way he treated the crew confirmed it. No names, no acknowledgement. Just roles. Camera guy, makeup girl. Like people didn't matter. Like they were just part of the set. And that's something I never tolerated. Because without them, there is no show. #4, Orson Welles. Orson Welles was brilliance. Pure and undeniable. When he spoke, people listened. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He had that kind of mind, that kind of presence. But brilliance comes with responsibility. And that's where things started to shift. Because Orson didn't believe in limits. Not in conversation, not in structure, and definitely not in time. I remember one appearance. Everything was running perfectly. The show was on track, segments timed, flow controlled, and then Orson started talking, and he didn't stop. Signals were given, subtle at first, then more direct. Time was running out, but none of it mattered, because in that moment, he wasn't a guest. He was in control. And suddenly, it wasn't my show anymore, it was his. And that's where the line was crossed. Not because of what he said, but because of what he ignored. The system, the structure, the people working behind the scenes to keep everything together. Because television isn't just about talent, it's about timing. And when you lose that, you lose everything. #5, Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was a legend, a name that carried history, respect, recognition. But sometimes, reputation hides things. At first, it was subtle the way people reacted when his name came up. A pause, a look, a hesitation that didn't need explaining. Because in this business, you learn to read those signals. And then I started seeing it myself, the comments, the behavior, the way boundaries were treated like suggestions, not rules. And the most uncomfortable part, people didn't want to talk about it. Because that's how things worked back then. You stayed quiet. You moved on. You didn't create problems. But I noticed. And once you notice something like that, you can't ignore it. Because there's a difference between misunderstanding and choosing not to understand. And what I saw was a pattern. One that made people uncomfortable. One that shouldn't have been ignored. And I didn't ignore it. Because there's one thing I always believed. No matter who you are, no matter how famous you are, you don't get to make other people feel unsafe. Not on my stage. Not ever. #6. Za didn't walk onto the show. She arrived like an event. Everything about her was larger than life. The voice, the attitude, the presence, on camera it worked. It was entertaining, colorful, unforgettable. But behind the scenes, that same personality became something else, something exhausting. Because before she even stepped into the studio, the demands had already started. Specific temperature, specific lighting, specific everything, and not suggestions, requirements. At first you try to accommodate it. That's part of the job. But with Zaza, it never stopped. There was always something missing, something wrong, something that needed to be fixed immediately. And if it wasn't, everything stopped. The show paused, the schedule shifted, people waited, because she refused to move until everything was exactly the way she wanted. And that's when it becomes a problem, because a show like mine doesn't revolve around one person. It can't. There are too many moving parts, too many people depending on timing. But she didn't see it that way. To her, the show adjusted to her, not the other way around. And that kind of mindset, it doesn't just slow things down, it disrupts everything. Because when one person believes they're bigger than the system starts to break. #7, Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters wasn't controlled chaos like Jerry, and she wasn't calculated like Joan. She was something else entirely. Unpredictable, not in a playful way, not in a way that makes good television, in a way that makes you lose control of the room. You'd ask a simple question, something like, something easy to build on. And suddenly, you weren't in a conversation anymore. You were in the middle of something else, something intense, something heavy. She didn't follow the rhythm of the show, didn't adjust, didn't ease into it. She took it somewhere else entirely. And once she got there, there was no bringing it back. I remember moments where I'd try to steer things, guide the conversation, find an exit. But it was like trying to stop a storm, because she didn't slow down, she didn't pause, she just kept going. And on live television, that's a problem, because timing matters, tone matters, control matters, and when you lose those things, you don't have a show anymore. You have a situation. Now, to be fair, what made Shelley different was that it didn't feel fake, it didn't feel calculated, it felt real, raw, unfiltered. And maybe that's what made it so difficult, because you couldn't predict it, and you couldn't contain it. #8, Bette Davis. Bette Davis didn't enter a conversation, she took control of it. From the moment she sat down, you could feel it, the confidence, the authority, the expectation that the room would adjust to her. And most of the time, it did. Because Bette didn't just respond, she challenged. Every question, every comment, every moment. It was like an interrogation disguised as an interview. On camera, it could be fascinating, sharp, witty, engaging. But behind the scenes, it became something else, something heavier. Because that same intensity didn't turn off, it stayed. And sometimes, it turned toward people who didn't deserve it. Staff, assistants, people just doing their jobs. And the way she spoke to them wasn't just direct, it was cutting, precise, designed to hit. And that's where I stepped in. Because there's a difference between being strong and being cruel. And that line matters, no matter who you are, no matter how talented you are. Because if you can't respect the people around you, then none of it matters. Not the awards, not the legacy, none of it. Hash 9, Jane Russell. Jane Russell was different. Not loud, not chaotic, not demanding in the same way as others. But what made her difficult was something deeper, something personal. Because off camera, conversations change. They become more real, more honest. And sometimes, that honesty reveals things you weren't expecting. Views, opinions, the way someone sees the world. And in Jane's case, those views created distance. Not just with me, but with people around her. Staff members, crew, people who suddenly felt uncomfortable in their own workplace. And that's where the problem starts. Because a show like mine relies on trust, on comfort, on people feeling safe enough to do their jobs. And when that disappears, everything changes. Because it's not about disagreement. People can disagree. That's normal. But when it turns into something else, something personal, something directed, that's when it crosses a line. And once that line is crossed, it's hard to ignore,